I guess this is high, isn't it? How awkward that I didn't get to finish my snake, which I will do quietly when you wonderful people are sharing the conversation. Welcome to Broadchurch, Feminism and Queerness in Modern Religion. It's brought to you by the Wheeler Centre and the wonderful Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm really thrilled to be speaking to this incredible panel of writers and thinkers from a really diverse range of backgrounds about how their identities have shaped, challenged and influenced by their connection and disconnection to religion and spirituality. Let's hear a whoop whoop, shall we? Just why not a bit of vibe on a Wednesday evening when it's so cold outside? I'm so glad that I can see your face on the second row there because there's a massive smile coming out of you, so thank you. I'm joined by four wonderful panellists, and I know you're going to get a lot from this evening. I'm delighted to introduce them to you. Bonhyom Sunim, a Buddhist monk, scholar, teacher and activist who came of age in the early 70s and was active in the early women's refuge collectives, and in the 80s worked with HIV/AIDS campaigns. In the 1990s, Sunim took robes and lived in monasteries in Thailand and Korea before returning to Australia in 2010, where she has since been active in chaplaincy and spiritual care. Please make her very welcome. Sitting beside her, well, actually, yeah, I'll do that. I'll do it properly. Sitting beside her, Jessica Knight is right there, writer, performer, widely published, and is interested in exploring themes of politics, art, and the self through her performing and personal writing. Jessica wrote and performed her show Mormon Girl in 2019 at the Melbourne Fringe Festival, and she is a Wheeler Centre Hot Desk Fellow and has participated in panels and readings at a number of writers' festivals. Welcome, Jessica. Aisha Saharan is a Malaysian Muslim trans woman and a social justice researcher. She's a board member of the Forcibly Displaced People Network and the Australia GLBTQIA+ Multicultural Council, while also doing her PhD on navigating Asian values and media responsibility. Her research focuses on LGBTQI+ and Islam, with a focus on improving social inequality. How do you have time for it all? Welcome! This does feel like a dating show, but I promise you it's not. Louise Omar, feminist writer, and very excitingly, I'll take my snake off this precious, precious book, has published widely, has read at events and participated in art residencies and group exhibitions all over the world. She's been a panellist at many writers' festivals and was also a hot desk fellow. I'm getting a theme running through here at the Ryan Wheeler Centre. Her first book, everybody, published by Scribe Publications, holding it high because it's an incredible book and an incredible achievement. It's called Holy Woman, A Divine Adventure. We're delighted that Neighbourhood Books, let's hear it for Neighbourhood Books, are selling here tonight, and Lou will be signing copies of Holy Woman after our chat. Huge congratulations and welcome to you, Louise. All right, let's kick it off. We will have time for questions from you this evening, and we would love to hear the sorts of inquiries that you have. We'll try and make it a nice solid 10 minutes at the end there where we'll come around with the microphone. But I have you all to myself for the moment. But please, I will invite you all to participate in this conversation at any period that you'd like to. Any questions that you have, let's throw them in and get this going. I'm going to kick off with you, Bonhyom. You're a member of the Rain Body. Is that Bodhi? Sorry.
Rain Body, yes.
Wow, this is so embarrassing. A spiritual friendship group of the LGBTQIA+ Buddhists and an advocate for more inclusion and diversity in the broader Buddhist community. Can you tell us why, of course, for you, the diversity in Buddhism is important?
Thank you. Thanks, Jacinta. That's a great question to start with. And I want to say thank you to the wonderful audience that's here, and also to say that this is the first time since, I think, maybe halfway through COVID, that I've been in front of a real audience. I'm used to the screen, so it's a little bit, daunting, actually. But I just want to start the answering the question really from the Buddhist end of that question, and just to say that in the Buddhist way of seeing, there's a concept of ontological emptiness, which basically means that everything, all beings, all forms are essentially empty of identity, and so the diversity of form is a moving parade. There's the essential reality is that everything is always changing, or impermanence is the key. So we too, in our form, are changing. We're born, we move into childhood, etc. And so the idea of a fixed identity in Buddhism is a bit of an anathema, actually. But it's recognising that there's an endless, boundless, abundance of forms coming into being and passing away. And so this idea of gender fluidity in the, can I call it the queer community? Can I do that? The others keep saying LGBTQIA.
Are we all comfortable with the term queer this evening? Yep.
Is that okay?
Well, I'm a queer woman of colour, so I'm perfectly fine.
Okay. So the idea of gender fluidity, which, some of the members of the LGBTQIA community identify with, is nothing, it's not hard for Buddhists to understand that. And of course, not every Buddhist will understand it, and I think that's partly also because, we also hold very strong ideas that come through our culture, which, have a big determination in terms of how we see the world. But generally, in the sense that you're not, you're not harming anyone, yourself included, really, it's an open slather. You can do what you want. As I say, as long as you're not harming anyone else, and that means, you can play in that field of changing comings and goings in the global space, really, and you can identify in any way you want, as a changing entity. And you'll see, of course, in the Buddhist imagery, also in the Hindu imagery, the karmic religions, or the karmic faiths, as we talk of them, they embrace diversity, they celebrate diversity, and you'll see many images in the Buddhist and the Korean, the Hindu, faiths of these fluid images, the shifting, changing gender images, and they're both a teaching, but they're also, a celebration of the change and the wonderful diversity in the world. I guess in terms of my own personal experience of diversity, I was very, very blessed, I think, to be born with a curious mind. And I think when you have a deep curiosity, you have to really move your focus from front and centre in this identity to be able to see and appreciate, the wonderful abundance of of different entities in the world. And so curiosity will take you, into the world with the question mark, rather than into the world with this is what I believe and therefore everything else is an aberration. Or, it just doesn't really have the same validity as the identity that I prescribe to. And so, I grew up in the 50s. I was born in the early 50s. And I grew up in Tasmania. And my mother used to tell a story about how I crawled out under the front gate before I could walk to go and explore the neighbourhood for the most exotic forms of life I could find. Now, I have to tell you that in the 50s, it wasn't easy to find. It was a time of, uniformity, really. But I did learn to play mahjong with a Chinese family. And, of course, that family were not greatly approved of by my parents. But, they weren't unusual. It was a very bland, very one-dimensional time, really, in Australian history. I was also a very spiritual child. I really had just an instinct for it from an early age. And of course, Christianity was, in those times, the only opportunity really to explore that. So, I went to Sunday school and church, and I kept going way after my siblings. They got out as early as they could, but I kept attending. And, it wasn't really until my teens, mid-teens, that, I started to question and look more deeply into, the dissonance that I saw between, the faith teaching and the lived faith experience. And in those times, of course, it wasn't me alone. I mean, there was a significant number of young people of my generation who left the church in that time. But it was also a time when the world was opening up, our world was opening up, the late 60s into the 70s. The other faith traditions, and spiritualities and, wisdom forms were coming into the West in a big way. And, I spent a year really, I think from my 18th, 19th year, living at the Satchinandra ashram, which was only just beginning at that time in Mangrove Mountain in New South Wales. And so that was sort of my introduction really to meditation and yoga and, practice. And that really, it whet my appetite, for more. And so I began the search. Spent years going backwards and forwards to India, living in the ashrams and all sorts of weird and wonderful practices. And, it was a smorgasbord.
Yeah, thinking about, you mentioned there the dissonance as well. Yeah. Louise, this is sort of where we could probably bring you in very, very much, in that you have danced in the dissonance between the self and the religion that you fully embraced when you were a teenager. Can you tell us about your former life in that fundamentalist and how it shaped the book that you've released, Holy Woman?
Dance in the dissonance is a great phrase.
That can be your T-shirt. Yeah. I'll give it to you.
Absolutely. So I used to be what I would call a feminist Christian. So I suppose that's what you are referring to when you say dance in the dissonance, because there's a few contradictions there, I would say. I'm not sure if I would have called myself a fundamentalist. It's a very strong word, but I was a Pentecostal for about 13 years. I came to the church as a teenager, and because there was a chaplain who at my school who was a youth pastor in the local youth group, and I followed my brother. I've got a twin brother. And he started going along to these really exciting nights, like there was skateboards and punk music and heaps of boys that I could talk to, or at least look at from afar. And so that's how I started going to church and entered into Christianity. And as I sort of grew up, I was involved in the church, like I volunteered and became more and more, took more leadership because there were some really nice rewards. Like I guess I was given a status in the community and I found belonging. And I also found a lot of purpose. I developed a relationship with God. And to me, that was like someone I would pray to, like speak to in my mind all the time, not just sort of like the official stuff, but a really intimate encounter, like in the inner world. And as I went to university and got involved in social justice through a lot of my church activities, I definitely identified as a feminist. And we were talking about this earlier today when I was on your radio program, Jacinta. I thought Jesus was a feminist, and a lot of people would use that label today because some of the things written in the Bible say that he was, I guess, transgressed some social boundaries about how to approach women or talk to women. But after a while, when I was in the church for about 13 years, my marriage broke down because I'd married a boy I'd met at youth group, and I stopped going. And I realized that being a feminist Christian and all the dissonance that happens within that, it wasn't working for me anymore, and I had lots of questions. I really wanted to know why God was a man. Did it have to be that way? Were there other options? And what did other women think about worshipping a male God? And that was the beginning of my holy woman journey. So thank you for promoting my book earlier.
No, we'll keep talking about it because it's such a wonderful exploration into asking the questions, pulling it apart. Aisha, pulling it apart, decolonisation. That's,
I just want to go back to the things that you mentioned about Christian as being a religion that is feminist religions. I can actually relate that to my experience as being a trans Muslim, and it's often that we think in a Western society that they think Islam is a religion that always oppresses women. But it's interesting when you see when there's a research that they did in America, they found that a lot of Muslim women actually identify themselves as feminist. It is interesting to see also that we have the same belief that Muhammad, our prophet, is also a feminist because, back in the 7th century, in that kind of particular time, he liberated women. He gave women's right. He gave women to have to own their own property, to actually also earn a practice during that time where there was a practice during that time that they killed the female babies alive because they thought that it's a baby girls could bring shame to the family, and when Islam came, it stopped this sort of barbaric tradition. Yeah, so it's interesting to see that when you talk about Christians as a feminist religion. It's things that I can also resonate to my identity.
And there's lots of strong female characters in the Islamic tradition, right? Like your namesake,
Aisha,
right?
Yeah, it's actually Prophet's second wife. That he was married when she was about 9. But we talk about that later. I just don't want to jump into one question to another. But we have she was actually one of the best narrators when it comes to having compilations of a prophet of hadith, which is because she was very close to the prophet, and she's called Mu'minun, so the mother of all Muslim people. Yeah,
incredible, and I guess in some ways we can dance in the dissonance again with you, Jess. In some ways, it feels like that's not your experience at all, Aisha. But for Jessica, your experience as a woman and your growing up as a Mormon, there was a lot of friction and fraction, and dissonance in that experience for you.
Yeah. But I didn't realise it was a dissonance or a friction until I had the language to describe it. Because when you're, I think the difference between like being born into a religion and coming at it of your own volition is like such a different way of coming to it. And I feel like maybe if I'd gone to a youth group that had punk music and cute boys, I may have been more likely to stay than going to the god-awful Mormon adolescent dances where there was no fun. There was not even a pretense of being cool. It was just a nightmare of watered-down cordial, awkward boys and girls, me getting constantly asked, so how old are you really? And me telling baffled people, I'm 16, and them just going, no, like really, because apparently when you're raised Mormon, you have no imagination. So yeah, there was that. And then also like growing up in a religion like that and being chronically ill and disabled and stuff, there's a lot of uncomfortable being used as an example for people in the church that I also didn't love or embrace all that much. Like, you're infantilized a lot and you're meant to be grateful for everything, and it doesn't allow space for anger. And I think the problem I have with being raised in a religion like the Mormon religion is that it doesn't allow negative emotions. You have to quash them down. It's like, if anyone's seen the musical The Book of Mormon, there's that whole song about putting it all in a box and smashing it. That's what you're meant to do. You just put all your bad feelings deep down, pretend they're not there, and just thank God for all your blessings. And when you're made to do that, those feelings can only be squashed for so long before they come out in like other ways, and it's not healthy. But you don't realise that until you're like doing a psychology degree and you're like, oh, I'm depressed.
Yes.
Yeah, look, I just, you know, I think I really appreciate the, you know, your stories. They're amazing, and I could spend a week with you at least.
Thank you.
But I do just want to say that, you know, after I left the Christian church and, you know, took my path, but I've had a lot of friendships over the years with Christian women, and particularly professed Christian women who's, you know, they have such a keen intelligence and spiritual sensibility. And, you know, I'm very grateful to have had those friendships because, you know, I've had the opportunity to see the Christian faith through different eyes. And so I guess, you know, for me, I do draw the line. You know, I think, you know, for personally, you know, I believe that there's a lot that falls short in the religious institutions and in the patriarchal nature of religions.
Speaking of the patriarchal thing, I'd just like to tell everybody that when you're raised Mormon, you get what's called a patriarchal blessing. It's right there in the heading, isn't it?
Wow.
That's interesting.
So when I was 17, you go to this man who's been ordained by the Mormon. I should say, obviously, it's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the proper name. The Mormon Church, the LDS Church has tried to separate themselves from the whole Mormon moniker because they feel that that's not very good branding, because of some of the offshoots of the LDS Church that apparently are a little bit fundamentalist and extreme. I don't know if anyone's read the book Educated, but like they don't want to be confused with those kind of Mormons where they're like living in the middle of nowhere and have 20 wives. My dad had one wife. It was my mum. She's great.
Well, speaking about patriarchy, let me just interject. I think I haven't answered your first questions about me, how I spent, you know, growing up in Malaysia, where it's pretty much a country that used to be colonized by British, and I learned that I carry a burdens of what we call as colonial metrics of power, where often that my identity or LGBTQIA plus people's identity has been erased to serve patriarchy. It is just that when I understand, when I found the truth that you can actually be Muslim and being a trans, or pretty much you can be LGBTQIA plus and being a Muslim, and it made me realize that it is not the religion that hates LGBT people. It's not Islam that hates LGBT people. it's the people, it's the patriarchy that controls the narrative of LGBT peoples. And this is why I believe, and I always want to put myself up front in terms of, fighting for my people's right, my trans people's, trans Muslim, because like I said, when I learned throughout the history that the trans people exist, we were the peoples who we was. So if you look at into Islamic histories, back in the, even up until the pre-colonial time, where in Mughal Empire, for example, you look at how gender variant peoples were appointed as part of the prominent figures in the palaces. They were there until the British came, and they introduced a law called Criminal Tribe Act, which also with intentions to erase, and because they think that the LGBT or the gender variant people, they held so much power that the British consider them as the ungoverned people. You see that this kind of legacy colonial metrics of power up until today, and this is when I realized that there's nothing wrong of being a trans.
That's such an important and fascinating distinction to make, and I know you speak so passionately about your faith, and you feel your trans identity is not compromised within your faith.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that you named colonialism.
Well, people don't often understand that colonialism and patriarchal, sometimes they work hand in hand. Totally. And we have a very, like in feminism, one of the things that I realized, Islam is also a religion that is intersectional, feminist, that upholds these values of intersectional feminist in every way. And because if you look at into the prophetic traditions of how the prophet actually always in like the traditions of Islam is always on the side of the peoples who are oppressed, the mustadafin, which was the women, which were the women and the slaves back then, and often in any kind of radicals or revolutions movement, we have peoples who are against that. Like back then it was the rich people, the male peoples who controls the power. They see that.
How does the patriarchal system, and I'll move on to you in a moment, Louise, but to you still, Aisha, how does the patriarchal system within whatever culture you're in this Australian context, for example, influence your experience as a Muslim woman?
Sorry, can you rephrase that?
It's a complex question. What I'm trying to understand is at the different cultural spaces that you practice your religion, how is it impacted by the culture that it sits inside?
I would say that, first and all, if I were born a cisgender woman, I don't think I would be sitting here today.
Yeah.
I would be just like happy be a cisgender woman, have a family, for example. But yeah, I guess being a trans woman, it puts me in situations where in Islam we have a principle called Khalifa. I'm not talking about Mia Khalifa here, okay? I'm talking about me, Khalifa. It means each of us as a Muslim, we are given a power or a responsibility to actually navigate your life. And I believe that being a trans, I have a position that I can actually speak out and speak up on behalf of my own people. It's a thing that will be, this thing called Khalifa, it's actually sort of like a power or responsibility that God gives every one of us, that we need to actually use it for any purpose, so that my purpose, that I can actually say that my purpose is actually to protect my people, to actually create a narrative of my own people. Because if I let cis hetero people write the narrative of LGBTQI and plus people, they're not gonna, they often discriminate us, and I wouldn't let them do that again.
It's such a beautiful reflection to understand what you're saying around that embedded aspect of your trans identity and your faith. They exist together so importantly. Yeah, Louise, you went and found so much stuff around the world. You went following the questions. The question fundamentally was, if God's a dude, where am I in this whole story? Looking then at the work of goddesses. You discovered the notion of defecting in place. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yes, absolutely. So defecting in place is a phrase that was coined by Miriam Therese Winter and some other researchers. In the 90s, she was a Catholic feminist theologian or feminist theorist in religion. And she interviewed, I think, up to 3,000 people in America who were women in Catholicism, asking them how they exist in a system that is ostensibly hostile to women, I would say. That book has since been criticised for its lack of Black or Latino perspectives, so it's also a little bit limited in that. But still, she coined the term defecting in place, which is describing how women and trans and non-binary people, I would expand that now, to how they revolt against the system while being within it. And so the three versions of this that I explored in my book and the people that I met were people who were reimagining traditional rituals, who were reinterpreting scripture and text, which is, Aisha, that's what your work does. So we've got a revolutionary right here on stage with us. And then also reworking names and images and symbols we have to imagine God and the divine figurehead. So it was fantastic to meet lots of radical people within the system who were working against it. So, for example, I met Reverend Anna Karin Hammar, who's a gay priest in Sweden, using different names and symbols to talk about God. For me, this is very important because there's a feminist theologian who just passed away last year called Carol Christ, and she says that the symbols and stories and images that we have to speak about God is really, in religion, is really powerful. And she said that if we are always worshipping a male God, this keeps us in a psychological dependence on male authority. So it sort of justifies patriarchal traditions of men always being the boss, you know. So that was really amazing to meet a woman who was doing that. And then I went to, I was researching some Jewish feminists who were reimagining mikvah, which is a very ancient tradition of bathing. And it was, you know, quite a sexist in its inception, but they have been reworking it to give it new meaning. And then lastly, I was in Morocco and I met the fabulous Dr. Asma Lamrabat, who you would know the work of, I'm assuming, maybe, I don't know. She's building on the work of like Fatima Menisi.
Yeah, I know Fatima Menisi.
Yeah, great. Reinterpreting, you know, Islamic texts from a feminist liberationist perspective. So things like you're saying, like Islam always being on this side of the oppressor, that was also my experience with Jesus when I was in the church. And I think, to be honest, this is the only way forward for religions, to like really be on that revolutionary trajectory.
But that's how they began.
Absolutely.
That's right.
That's the divergence that has taken. So yes, returning to the root.
And Jess, you sit there beautifully in the middle, having not defected in place, but defected outside of place,
Yeah.
which is a really equally essential process that you go through. Have you maintained faith in?
No.
Thanks for joining us, Jess. End of the show. Bye, everyone.
Sorry.
No, just elaborate.
No, I should let you finish the question.
No, it really was that. When and perhaps faith was never embedded in your experience of religion. Perhaps it was a separate encounter altogether. But in your living of life, is there any of those aspects that you draw on?
I have a scorched earth policy, when it comes to my religious upbringing, which means I've blown it up behind me and I will not be going back. So, yeah, I mean, I did have faith, but when you're a kid, you're going to believe what your parents and the grown-ups around you tell you. So if they tell you that something is true, you're going to believe it, right? Like you believe your parents are the people that won't. I mean, why would they lead you in anything that would hurt you or anything like that? I mean, they love you. So I just did what I was meant to, squashed the bad feelings down, went to church, did all of that. And then through no fault of my own, I realised there were parts of myself that didn't fit into the gender binary of the Mormon religion, which is like women are women, men are men, you don't have sex till you're married, you have children, you raise them in the church, and that's it. I mean, there's literally a pamphlet that you're given when you're 12 that's called For the Strength of Youth, and that pamphlet says, in no uncertain terms, being same-sex attracted is an affront to God, and if you're feeling those feelings, you are meant to go to your bishop and they'll help you through it. Now, that's not like a sexy thing. That's a thing where, like, it's not like a bishop and they're like, I've been having these feelings. It's not that at all. You go, you tell them how you're feeling, and then they, I guess, guilt you into squashing those feelings down, tell you that it's bad for you and it will hurt God and hurt yourself and your family, and you're meant to go on your way. So I can only imagine that would have been pretty horrible, because I was only a bit weird. Like, I found out that I didn't have a uterus when I was 16 years old, and I'd been raised in a church where motherhood was the be-all and end-all. Like, that's what I was. My life was trajectorying to that point, and that was the end goal, getting married and being a mum. And then to be born without a pretty important machinery in a body that you're told that God made for you, well, then what was I meant to think? Like, did he do that on purpose? Was this meant to be some kind of learning experience? Or was it a way for me to deflect in a very concrete way and make up my own rules outside of the world that I was raised in, if that makes sense? So I kind of had to move away from that and find a way where I could be happy and fulfilled in other ways. Hence, education, art, music, the devil's music, not hymns. I'm sorry, I have a real aversion for Mormon hymns. They're pretty lame. Has anyone ever listened to the Mormon Tabernacle Choir?
Wow.
Yeah, it's not fun.
No. Sounds like something we
Anyone?
don't search.
No one?
No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
we did.
No,
I'd
no.
get you to sing us. No, we will not do that to you at any point.
No, it's not.
Bompion, what do you think? You've described that in your tradition, in your faith experience in that organisation of faith, that it is an inclusive space for queer community and those that sit outside, the binaries and the patriarchy. Do you think it's an inclusive environment and it encounters the human in all its facets?
Look, I think, again, we go back to the dissonance, don't we? As human beings, we grow up in cultures and the teachings of the faith, as it is with any of the faiths, are very clear about a lot of things, but human beings tend to kind of pervert them over time. And so I think that Buddhist communities, generally, probably, certainly there's nothing that, in terms of the teachings, that disallows people to embrace the diversity. And I think they are better. But, I was invited, in my young years, I came into the refuge movement in the 70s, and that became my refuge, really, from the heterosexual world that I'd grown up in, and you know, had been damaged by as well. You know, like many women, I have my own Me Too story. But you know, I think we, you know, we found that meeting as sisters, and you know, we became, we worked together, we were lovers, we were activists together, and you know, the power of that was, you know, was quite amazing. But after I ordained, took that path, a lot of that, you know, kind of disappeared into the background. I mean, you have to understand that monasteries are not the safest places, really, for LGBTQIA people to come out. And what I found in some of the Asian monasteries was that, you know, among the older, you know, generation of women, that they still believed that they had to be born into a male body to be able to attain nirvana or enlightenment, which is a kind of pinnacle in the Buddhist path. So where do these, you know, values come from? They're not part of the teaching, but they're very active in the...
Rude. We can only imagine what is going on out there. Back to our peaceful contemplation, and you were saying,
Yeah, so it was not until you know, the Rainbody Bante Kaliko, Venerable Kaliko, who began that with some friends. You know, it wasn't until he invited me to be part of the inauguration of that group, asked me to speak at that event, and you know, that was an amazing event. It was up in Newtown in Sydney, in the town hall, standing room only. And that night, you know, I listened and heard many, many stories of LGBTQIA Buddhist people, you know, talking about how they felt excluded and disrespected and uncared for by the wider Buddhist community. And so, you know, that night, I suppose, it was like, in a way, I outed myself again. I made that connection back with my, you know, my earlier life in that aspect of my life. And, you know, I didn't come out publicly. I didn't make a big announcement. I think people know, you know, you just know. and when you say that's, you know, that's your life, they say, of course, I know. But the thing with that was that, you know, it really helped me to see that community, that the, you know, the LGBTQIA community is still my community, you know, and I can have the benefit of that, but I also have responsibility. And at this stage of my life, you know, it's a very different relationship that I have to that community. And the responsibility is really because I can, and you know, I have the advantage of lots of possibilities of being able to speak out, and you know, and actually tell the story of you know, of great suffering of that community. I mean, when you look at, you know, the last few years in Australian politics, you know, we've just been, you know, battered really. With round after round after round, we had the same-sex marriage debate, you know, which was, you know, so damaging, you know, to that community. And, you know, the people voted with their feet. I mean, the Australians, you know, they said, yes, we don't have any problem with it, you know, but still in the Parliament and then we have the Religious Freedoms Bill and the draft after draft of that. And, you know, that just gave opportunity, really, for, you know, a small number of religious leaders to have a platform to express their bigotry, you know, about, you know, the LGBTQIA community. Then we had during the last election campaign, we had the transgender attack. You know, this has been years and years and years. And then we look at the result of the 2021 census, you know, and the rate of people who have walked away and say no, no, we're not anymore.
And also, Aisha, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just going to say about, you know, we see the recent elections, how Scott Morrison's laws, he said, it speaks a volume of how Australians, they no longer want to play this kind of transphobic, because it's no longer something that I want to, it's the things that no matter how the media has the power to actually control, Murdoch media, you think about how about 75% of media in Australia is controlled. And apart from that, being the, you know, the votes, memorandum votes on Scott Morrison, but also it says that you can't play this kind of narrative anymore. You can't play this.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. I want to make some time for the audience to ask questions because I can feel the energy of questions coming from them. Louise, you began this incredible book that I mentioned. It's really, really good, and it's up the back and you can buy it. You began this with a real wonderful intention to find out how one might be a feminist and remain in religious institutions. And you thought a couple of dot points, give everyone a good indication. And what any good writer and journalist and researcher will do is find themselves in a place that perhaps they didn't expect to be. You weren't able to reconcile those two, were you?
I wasn't. And as I spoke about earlier, many women do. They defect in place. They revolutionise things from within. And that's really powerful. But for me, because I looked at the history of how my religion had been constructed in the social context of patriarchy, and I came to the personal conclusion that, and also followed the feminist scholarship that I was reading, that said that this was also created in order to justify patriarchy, naturalise male power, and only limit our conception of power to be masculine through the symbology of the Father God. And I decided it's time to kill the Father God. So I had this existential crisis. The Bulgaria, Turkey chapter is my favourite in the book because I'm just wandering around.
Go straight there.
Oh
Go
my
to
God.
Bulgaria.
It was snowing. I was lost and alone. I was watching Gilmore Girls till 2 p.m. Yeah. So it was classic crisis. And I just gave it up. I decided it was no longer for me. Then there was a lot of psychological unravelling. A few of the chapters of the book try and explore what exactly was the ideology that I didn't want to agree with anymore, how it had shaped my understanding of the world. Like I just had to kind of reconstruct the framework with which I viewed the world. And then at the end, so this is a bit of a spoiler alert. The
Do you want
last
to give
chapter.
it away? Yeah, do it.
Yeah, it's a pretty good one. So
I'm still buying the book, don't worry.
Oh, please do, Jess. I'd love you to read it. So I was in Prague and I had decided I'd already decided I don't want to do this anymore. When I was 19, I'd chosen to be baptised because in this Pentecostal tradition, you choose as an adult rather than having it done to you as a baby. And it was this whole, I invited my family, people gave me cards, I gave my testimony, and I got dunked by the pastor of my church. But so 9 years after that, I decided I don't want this anymore. Kind of inspired by how the Jewish women that I had met were reworking the tradition of mikveh. So I went to a nudist lake in Prague. The reason why it has to be in it's in the book, but it's part of the story. Got naked on a hillside next to other people and went into the water and said, "In the name of the mothers, I renounce my baptism."
That's powerful.
Yeah, and when I dunked 3 times in the mikveh tradition. So apologies for Jewish people for taking on. It was an inspiration, it's not the same thing for sure. And when I rose, I said, "I am whole," which is a way to reclaim a lot of the things I'd lost with trying to be holy.
That's incredible. And again, it's a wonderful book and you'll be signing them at the conclusion of this. Aisha, as it's been beautifully highlighted, you're a revolutionary. You are defecting in place and, you know, you are exposing and expressing such a beautiful union that you have with your identity and your faith. What's your advice if there is such a, you know, thing to even suggest for other people who feel marginalised but have such strong faith? What would you say?
Well, I think as someone who are big fans of decolonizations, you need to, as a person, as an individual, you need to find your own truth. Find it because religion, more often than not, they don't, as in, when I said religion, I refer to patriarchal controls of the religions that tell LGBTQI plus people that they're not valid. But don't find it through them. Find your own truth through your understanding of religion, be a Muslim. As a Muslim, I can say that be reflective on a first verse that was revealed to the Prophet. It was Iqra, it means read. Read means it's God wants you to be reflective. God wants you to use your brain to actually be more reflective and be more reflexive of your journey of finding your own truth, rather than just like obediently follow whatever religious preachers tell you. And also, it's okay to actually find a religion as not being an outlet that actually help you, because it's also okay to actually feel, disassociate with religion, because religion is not something that you can't force on people. In Islam, we have a saying in Quran which says, "La ikraha fid din," it means there's no compulsions in every religion. So that's the reason why I'm still a Muslim today, because I believe Islam actually provides a space for trans LGBT people.
Incredible, and we thank you so much for your insight and reflections. Jess, we also really appreciate yours, and you have still unravelling yourself from the experience that you had within a religious institution. Do they listen to your reflections about what? I love yes and no with Jess.
No, it's just like, as I was saying before, there's just, it's in black and white in the teachings of the church. It's incredibly patriarchal. It's very white. The colonialism, the white saviorism, it's all there. Like, there's no way around it, really, at all. I mean, they say that sex before marriage is a sin just as bad as murder, and also denying the Holy Ghost, which is like the gospel of the Mormon religion. So I've done both of those things. So if there is an afterlife, I am in huge trouble because I was also raised, like when you're in the Mormon church and you're raised in it, you are told that because I was born under the covenant, that means that the rules are pretty strict for me. So because I was born into it and I was given the gift from birth of the gospel, that means to walk away from it and deny it is a pretty big deal. Whereas other people who are just blissfully ignorant of the whole thing and maybe don't ever get a Mormon missionary knocking on their door, you guys are fine. No worries, you didn't get the opportunity. But if you've actually shoved a door in the face of a Mormon missionary, sorry guys, you're fucked.
Awkward. I think we all need to go and work out what to do from here.
I'm sorry for swearing.
We will get to your questions in just one moment. I'll give you the final word, Sunim, about your reflections on reflecting and how important it is for you and in the way that we think about ourselves and the world, the moments of contemplation that we've been speaking about.
Look, I think that most religions and wisdom paths would say that it's incredibly important to find some stillness and just to stop for some time and let the I-ness give it a break.
Let the truck take over.
Yeah, that's right. And,
sorry, there's a truck outside.
The thing is that again in the Buddhist path, I mean, we do have an understanding that everything is interconnected. And so, we have great responsibility to, take care of each other and, to really realise the truth of interconnection. It does mean that we need to, let that, move towards separation and I-ness, give it a break. And that then allows us to reconnect with the universal flow. And we have to do that over and over and over again. We're human, so we're slow learners. But I think that is to understand that there's nothing static. And so, the practice gives us the opportunity really to learn how to ride the waves of change and, to actually embrace change in a more positive way. And that's something that, seems to be very, very important in our world today.
Certainly is. And I would like you to join me in just a rousing gratitude and thank you so much to the four of you, Bon Hyun, Jess, Aisha and Louise. Please give them a round of applause. Such thoughtful reflections and such great insight. Thank you so much. But I'd love to open it up to you and you and also to you over there. If you have a question, please raise your hand because we have, oh, look at that, bang! 2 hands waving. I can see you. It's coming towards you.
Thank you very much for the conversation. It was a fantastic evening. I feel like there were so many commonalities that I could relate to in my own faith journey, or akin to Jess, my lack of faith currently. But my question is directed towards Aisha. So for some context, I grew up Muslim for 16 years, following the mainstream faith, and would now consider myself an atheist. But viewing your perspectives on Islam and LGBTQIA+, there are a fair few things which I disagree with. Regardless, considering that your perspective is so independent from what I would consider or what I would describe the mainstream faith, do you still participate in that mainstream faith or those cultural centres, mosques or Islamic community centres? Or is your practice of the faith in a social sense more towards people who consider themselves as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community and as a Muslim? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Can I just answer that?
Go for it. Yeah.
So if I want to talk about my experience of being a trans, migrating from Malaysia. In Malaysia, let's start with Malaysia first. When I was in Malaysia, my parents, they're very accepting. So I go to mosque. I push the boundaries just because I feel like, I just want to show that to the world that being a trans, like a Muslim also can be a Muslim can also be a trans, and I carry that in Australia. Even in Australia, I go to the mosque. I push the boundaries. I go to the mosque. I go to the praying place at my university at UQ, at University of Queensland, where recently the people said, because what happened was it was only in 2019 that I came out from a stealth mode as being a trans, like I'm openly being a trans now, but back before then because of the female passing privilege that I had. Well, it's not supposed to be privilege, because then it is very discriminatory to people who are not privileged because transition is very expensive. So when they found out that I'm a trans, I did a few interviews with SBS, for example. They found my articles, they found my journals, and it's kind of interesting because when they saw me, the same people that used to be my friend, they did not want to touch me anymore because in their mind, I was born a male. I was born assigned male at birth, which is true. I no longer want to associate myself with these people. So when it happened to me last time, of course, I was breaking down. I called my mentor and I talked to my therapist about this. But then I realized, you know what? I need to dissociate myself with these people. I need to remove myself with these people and need to be more with people who can accept me. But the bottom line is, regardless of how many people that I've lost in my life, as in my Muslim friends, I've got my Muslim friends who, my ex-housemate was a Iraqi refugee female that I used to live with her for 4 or 5 years. And when she knew that I'm a trans, she just, she told me, Aisha, I can't live with you anymore. But then it was like actually good riddance when she left, really, other than other issues. But there are Muslim people. My current Muslim housemate, she knows that I'm a trans. She said, I already know that you're trans because, she found out my articles. People have been sharing my articles through their groups, but this person, she said to me, I only knew that you're trans back in 2019, but I stayed with her, as a housemate in 2014. But she said she see me as an individual person, as a friend, as someone who very accommodating because, she wants to stay with me. And we still hug, we still talk, and I want to see more Muslim people like this. Just when I can change, just because, I'm not here to change the whole entire perspective of Muslim towards LGBT people, towards trans people, but it is a movement that I want to carry so that in the future, trans Muslim can be liberating.
Beautiful, really powerful. Thank you so much for that wonderful question too, and thank you, Aisha. Another question from the audience. We've probably only got time for maybe one or so more. You're so cute. Little question. I think that's, okay, encouraged. Last question.
Hi, thanks again for the conversation. I just wanted to talk further around the dissonance or the tension between defecting and defecting in place. Just my own context, I was raised Catholic and I'm queer, and there's been a lot of dancing in the dissonance in my own journey. With defecting in place, how do you find protecting your own psychological safety in doing that? Because there's a lot of power in that, but I also find that there is a lot of pain, and it can be really painful to come back to institutions and to spaces that can be quite hostile to you.
Louise, do you want to take that one?
Yeah.
I mean, for sure, but I'm no longer defecting in place, to be clear. I rejected that religion because it wasn't okay for me. I defected. I suppose you are the one who sets the boundaries. How much are you willing to sacrifice to make change? It's really important to take care of yourself because, for example, you said you grew up Catholic. Even before we bring the homophobia of the Catholic Church into it, we have the in the news lately about the Catholic Church rejecting again women to be deacons, which is an observed construct that today we still can't see women as having the same power as men. To me, like you said, that's really hostile. So it depends how much you're willing to fight for it, and only you can decide that. I would also say that there are other ways outside of it as well.
Yes. And your book explores that. I think it's perhaps not that I'm pushing it on anyone, but it's a wonderful book, and it's a really thoughtful exploration that actually goes deep into a whole lot of ways that this can be discussed and described. Thank you all again. It's such an illuminating conversation and taken us into such great places of thought and reflection, and I thank you all so much again for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.